Magnus Carlsen returned to classical chess after a long time, and this was the first round of Gremke Classic. And he faced Richard Rapport, who starts with e4. Magnus plays the Caro Cann, and now after d4, d5, here comes the advanced Caro Cann. Magnus invites the advanced variation with g4, h4. Rapport starts with h4. Now g4 is a threat which will trap the bishop if black plays e6, for example. So you don't want to allow that. So Magnus plays h5. And here comes bishop d3, takes, and queen a5. All this is book. c3 is also been played before. e6, cementing the pawn structure, preparing c5. And here comes a4, preparing to gain space on the queen side with b4. And here Magnus played a move that has not been played before, c5. Now pawn takes. Of course, black can't take with the desirable bishop takes because of b4. So queen has to take. So you can see why this is not preferred so much at the top level, because the queen is the only piece developed. So is it is for white, but black's queen has to run around a little bit. Knight f3, queen goes back, preparing to bring the bishop out to c5. Knight a3, and Magnus decides to chop off that knight. Rook takes, knight d7, and castles. Magnus gets ready to castle shot. Rook e1, defending that pawn. Rook c8, and now queen d1. Pawn a6, and here comes bishop g5. So if black castles, the h5 pawn is a little bit soft. That's the purpose of queen d1 move. Bishop g5, threatening to take on e7, and black won't be able to castle. Knight g6. Now Magnus is putting pressure on e5. How do you defend this? You can't play bishop f4. You will have to play something like queen e2, but even that won't defend it. After knight takes, okay, that will defend it. Queen can take back, but it's a little bit awkward. Rapport finds another way to deal with the situation. He just plays a5, ignoring the threat to the pawn. He gains control of the b6 square, gaining space. And now Magnus just castles, because if you take, bishop f4 would be a slight problem. And here rook a4, a very nice move, a rook lift from a3 to a4, making it more active. You can even swing to the king side if given the opportunity. Right now it's not there. But you can see at some point if this queen becomes active and if the h pawn needs support and rook g4 comes in, it will be problematic for the king. So here rook e8. Magnus is preparing to break with f6. So the e6 pawn is defended by the rook. And here comes rook d4. Preparing to play c4. Knight d2 is an idea, queen e2 is an idea, and d5 pawn is a little bit weak. Now knight takes e5 was chosen by Magnus. This is where the game becomes interesting. Here Rapport takes, Magnus takes back. Rapport had a choice between queen takes pawn and bishop f4. This is a critical moment. Rapport chose bishop f4. Queen h5 is a subtle change compared to bishop f4. So the point is after queen h5, okay, first let's see what happens after bishop f4. f6 takes, the h pawn has to go, and now queen f7 takes. Here, as you see, black is threatening e5. It will be a fork. So you'll have to either move the rook or the bishop. Now in the other variation, instead of bishop f4, if you play queen takes pawn, f6 is no longer possible. That is the main point. Because if you play f6, can you find out the killer blow? Just a sack. If rook takes, there is rook takes e5. If g takes, there is still rook takes e5, and the pawn can't take because now rook g4 comes. Queen will have to give itself up, but after rook takes king takes, it's a winning position for white. Queen takes pawn and queen against two rooks, but the king is not safe. Which means after queen takes h pawn, here black has to play f5 to prepare queen f7. You need some defense here. Rook g4 is also coming after bishop f4. And now, if you continue the same line, bishop f4, queen f7, takes, e5 is not that easy. There is a hold on e5 square, and you will again have to move either the rook or the bishop, but this pawn structure is not that problematic compared to when the pawn was on f6. Then e5 would come with the tempo. Here, game would continue rook d3, and if e5, bishop back, the pawns are a little weak. E5 pawn is attacked twice, defended twice, and now how do you defend d4? It's not possible. You will lose the one of the pawns. If you play rook d8, you lose the e pawn. So that wouldn't be the case with the pawn on f6. So which was why the move played by Rapport loses the advantage. Queen h5 would have been the correct choice. But of course, it's a very subtle difference. Now f6 happened. Queen takes h5. Queen f7. Takes, and we have an endgame. Again, the fork is a threat, so bishop has to go back. Here comes king h7. Pawn g4, gaining space on the king side. There is more control for black, for Magnus in the center. So you can see why he preferred this with black. E5 is coming, right? But you can also see that Rapport has space on the king side with these pawns. And the rook is active. The bishop is a better piece against this knight. It's sort of dominated. These pawns and the bishop are dominating the knight. So here, knight went to d8, ready to come to c6. Now, this endgame is equal. So let's see what happens. Bishop d6. The bishop becomes active before e5 comes. The rook moves, and now rook b4. Pressure on Magnus. Magnus deals with pressure like this. Knight c6. He takes. Magnus also takes on a5. Now that knight's becoming active, the rook is already on the 7th rank, but knight c4 and b pawn would be weak. This bishop is stopping rook b8. So here Magnus plays knight c4. Rapport plays b3, asking Magnus to take, which would lose a pawn for Magnus. So he wouldn't do that. He goes knight d2, threatening a fork. Rook e2, knight takes b3, and now bishop e7. So temporarily Magnus is up a pawn, but f6 is weak. There is a threat of bishop takes f6. So black will have to move the king. And now king f1, pawn e5, rook b2, knight goes back, and now rook b6. So the overall activity was enough for Rapport to gain back the pawn. A6 pawn is undefended. Can you defend it? Is rook a8 possible just to defend? You can play rook d6, but there's a killer move. Bishop takes f6, and pawn takes, rook g6, and now g5. King moves and rook h7. So black will lose the rook if that happens. So he can't defend the a pawn passively with rook a8. So Magnus goes knight c4, giving back the pawn. Now it's completely equal. Magnus still has a huge mass in the center, but white's pieces are very active. Here rook a8. Magnus wants to exchange of a pair of rooks. Now it's even more drawish. Rook takes d5, but then rook becomes active. Bishop c5. Right now, Rapport is a pawn up. Rook c2. Magnus gets back the pawn. Rook d3 is possible, but this pawn is still perennially weak. e4 will come, and the rook will have to jump over to g3 or h3. So here, Rapport had a choice, but now you can see both of them are in time pressure. Rapport had this rook d7 move, giving back the pawn, but then bishop f8. And there are problems on g7 square. This pawn would fall. So rook d7 was a good move, a winning move almost. But Rapport in time pressure plays rook d3, a safe choice. And here Magnus had a lot of options. He had e4, for example. And after e4, if the rook goes over to g3, for example, keeping control of the pawn, black can just play g5 and exchange of some pawns. If h5, you can even think of f5. But there is also knight d2 check and the knight f3. So it becomes a decent position for black. You will get back this pawn some way or the other. But in the game, Magnus, with just 14 seconds on his clock, played a move that he would never play, that he would not want to look at again. He played knight d2 check, preparing to jump to e4. And that was a big blunder. Rapport instantly punished him with rook takes d2. And that was it. Because the point is, after rook takes, bishop e3 wins back the rook, and it's a piece up for Rapport. He's already a pawn up. So a very unfortunate end for that game for Magnus Carlsen, the world number one. He was close to having a fighting draw. Having fought so much, he could have taken the draw here, but instead of just keeping the tension with not knight d2, with e4 and then knight d2, he directly played knight d2, and that led to his loss.